In the summer of 2018, I went back to summer camp with teenagers for the first time in over a decade. While there, I witnessed and experienced one of the most powerful nights ever in my 21 years of ministry. The speaker, Tim McCain, asked some camp staff to write letters of apology from the perspective of those who had wronged teenagers over their young lives. Letters were written from the view of an absent dad, a drug-addicted mom, a backstabbing friend, a sibling, a bully, the church, a former cutter, self-image issues, and depression. During the time where these letters were read aloud, you could hear people crying all across the room, and you could see the staff members in tears as they read the letters they had written. I don't think there was a dry eye in the building. Then came time for students to respond to an altar call if any of those letters would have been from them or to them in their lives. So many young men and women came forward. I had the opportunity to pray for young men whose fathers were absent, neglectful, or hurtful to them. Before I prayed, I chose to tell them my story of the words my dad once said to me that had deeply and negatively impacted my life. I then prayed with them and embraced them as their dad should. I told them to hug me the way they would want to hug their dad. I spoke words of affirmation into their lives as only a dad could. I was their dad in that moment, and there was such freedom in those boys' lives that night. So many were affected that night by God through others because the right words were spoken at the right time. Words carry so much weight and power with them. They can speak imagination, or spark imagination rather, or shut down the most creative person. They can lift others up or cause massive destruction. Proverbs 18:21 says it this way: the tongue has the power of life and death. So choosing our words can be life-giving or life-taking. That's an incredible responsibility. How come then so many are so flippant with their words? Not just verbally either. In this day and age of social media, people can let loose a tirade of words at unexpected recipients in a matter of seconds. This can even happen between people who both claim to be following Jesus. On Sunday, they tag their local church when they go to church and say how wonderful the services were, but on Monday, they tag each other with harsh words of criticism, hate, and disdain. The impact of words spoken was no less powerful 2,600 years ago when Daniel and his friends were alive. I think they knew it, for they definitely demonstrated it in chapter 2 of the book of Daniel. Last week we saw how the king, Nebuchadnezzar, was impressed with them for the first time he met them, and that he found them 10 times more capable than any of the other advisors in his kingdom. It's possible that this first encounter where he felt this way is the one we read about in Daniel 2. It's in this chapter where we see a few significant things about the words we use. The first words with power come not from Daniel or his friends, but from the king's other advisors. Here's what happened. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and asked for its meaning, but he refused to tell anyone the dream. He wanted them to not only tell him the dream's meaning, but tell him the dream too. Here's where the power of words first come in. No one on earth can tell the king his dream, and no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked such a thing. The king's demand is impossible. No one except the gods can tell you your dream, and they do not live here among people. These words were like shutting off the water that flows through a dam. It cut off all the potential from a massive power supply called God. Now, before you give these guys a hard time, you realize we all have done this, right? We say, we'll never get out of debt. We hear, you'll never amount to anything in your life. Or, our marriage is over. I'll never get the job I want. You're always so rude and insensitive. Words like these cut short the potential of what God can do, even in the most desperate and devastating of circumstances. But to live set apart from the world, to live holy lives in an unholy land, means to never shut off the power supply. Rather, it means to tap into it. Instead of saying, we'll never get out of debt, celebrate when you pay off a bill, because you're one step closer to being debt-free. Rather than saying you'll never amount to anything in your life, tell those you love you have what it takes to do it. And even when your marriage feels like it's over, commit to being in this with your spouse all the way to the end. And despite not getting that job, don't say, I'll never get the job I want, but say, I may have not got that job, but there's one coming. And finally, Instead of pointing the finger at someone else and telling them they are always rude and insensitive, look at yourself first and ask yourself, is there something wrong with me? And then ask them to please forgive you and apologize for what role you played in the situation. This keeps the water flowing and the power going. This is exactly what Daniel did. When he heard about the king's decisions to kill all his advisors, including himself, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, he didn't panic and say, woe is me, my life is over. No, he used wisdom and asked a question. Asking questions in difficult circumstances helps us know how to tap into our supernatural power supply. If Daniel had not asked, at best, he would have been praying too generic a prayer to God. At worst, he would have died. Daniel also didn't do this alone. He asked his 3 friends to pray and to pray with him for the answer to the king's demands. Scripture says 1 can send 1,000 to flight, but 2 can send 10,000. This means there is multiplied power when we get others involved. The last thing, and perhaps the most important thing to saying the right thing at the right time, is learning to give credit where credit is due. Daniel gave God credit privately and publicly. It's one thing to thank God during your time alone with Him. It's another to tell the one in charge of your well-being it was God who did it and not you. But that's what Daniel did. Daniel replied, there are no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or fortune tellers who can reveal the king's secret. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. One final thing of importance here. When Daniel was speaking to the king, he was speaking the language of Babylon, Aramaic. In fact, Daniel wrote part of his book in Hebrew and part of it in Aramaic, as if he wanted to speak to both the Jews and the Gentiles, the holy and the unholy. That was only possible because Daniel took 3 years to learn the Babylonian language. He had the unique ability to speak the language of God's people and the language of the culture that he lived in. We need to learn how to speak the language of God's people and the language of the culture that we live in. We need to know how to speak to those close to God and those far from God if we are going to be able to live holy, holy lives in an unholy land. When the NBA and the NHL both returned to playing games this summer, they did it in what they called the bubble. Once people were in this confined area, they had to stay, or if they left, they wouldn't be let back in. The problem with the bubble is how they were cut off from really knowing the impact they were having on people's lives. This is true if we as Jesus followers try to live in our own Christian bubble. A bubble where all we do is read, listen, and watch Christian books, music, and programming. We will have no clue what is going on in the culture and not really know the impact we are having or not having on people's lives. So burst the bubble and be like Daniel. Learn how to speak not just to those who follow Jesus, but to those who don't. That will really set you apart from others. And like Daniel, you'll stand out among the rest when you speak.